Hello, benchwarmers, and welcome again to the Bench Report. You're listening to Amy and Ivan.
Hello, everyone.
Today, we've looked at a House of Commons debate from March 27th, 2025.
That's right. And the main topic was potential changes to personal independence payments, or PIP as it's usually called.
And how those changes might affect carers allowance, too. Our job here is simple. We want you to understand these possible changes, who they might affect, and the main arguments being made. No jargon, just the facts.
Exactly. So the starting point is this government green paper titled Pathways to Work.
Right, the green paper.
And it lays out these plans for changing PI. The government's core argument is that the current cost of PIP is, well, unsustainable.
Unsustainable how? They mentioned some figures, didn't they?
They did. They stated that costs have been rising by about £2 billion above inflation each year for the past 5 years.
Wow, $2 billion a year above inflation. That's quite a sum. So that's the driver for change.
That's the stated driver, yes. The goal, they say, is to focus support more tightly on those with the greatest needs.
Okay, focusing support. How will they actually do that? Does this mean new laws?
It does. Making these changes will require new primary legislation, so it'll have to go through the full parliamentary debate and scrutiny process.
And when might this actually kick in?
The current plan aims for implementation in November 2026.
November 2026. And who gets affected then? Is it everyone on PIP?
No, it would affect new claimants applying after that date, and also existing claimants, but only when they have their next scheduled award review after November 2026.
Ah, so not an immediate change for current recipients.
Not immediately, and they've also said that people with very severe conditions who are unlikely ever to work will be protected. That's an important caveat.
Okay. Now, you mentioned carer's allowance. PIP and carer's allowance are linked, aren't they?
They are, very closely. Eligibility for carer's allowance often depends on the person being cared for receiving certain components of PIP.
So if PIP changes,
then carer's allowance is inevitably impacted. The government acknowledges this. They know it affects the main carer's allowance and also the carer element within universal credit.
so what are they doing about that potential impact?
They're currently consulting on it. They're asking for views on what sort of transitional protections might be needed for people who could lose out when PIP changes.
Transitional protections, meaning temporary help to adjust.
Potentially, yes. Ways to cushion the blow for those affected. But alongside that, there is actually some positive news for some carers.
Oh, what's that?
The earnings threshold for carer's allowance, that's the amount you can earn while still claiming, is going up.
How much by?
It's increasing by £45 a week, taking it up to 196 CELPs per week.
That sounds like quite a helpful increase.
The projection is that this could benefit over 60,000 carers by the financial year 2029-30. So it helps more people combine some part-time work with caring.
That's one side. But there are still big concerns about the overall impact of the PIT changes on carers, aren't there?
Oh, absolutely. There are some stark figures being discussed. Estimates suggest around 150,000 carers could potentially lose their carers allowance altogether because of the PIP changes.
150,000 people.
Yeah.
And the financial hit.
Well, the total amount potentially taken away from carers could be around £500 million.
$500 million. That's enormous.
It is. And organizations like the Joseph Rowntree Foundation have done some analysis suggesting some couples where one gets PIP and the other gets carers allowance could face losses of up to £12,000 a year.
£12,000 a year. That's life-changing for many households. It sounds quite drastic. Is the government rushing this?
The government insists they aren't. They point to the timeline over 18 months until that November 2026 implementation date.
Mm-hmm.
And as we said, existing PIP recipients aren't affected until their first review after that date, which could be up to 3 years away for some. Plus, they are considering those transitional arrangements.
So the underlying rationale remains focusing PIP support.
Yes, concentrating it on those with the most severe impairments. They argue this is necessary to ensure PIP remains sustainable in the long run.
Predictably, the opposition has raised objections.
Yes, quite strongly. They brought up a previous conservative plan, which involved potentially converting PIP into vouchers, something that caused a lot of anxiety at the time.
I remember that.
They're criticizing these current plans as cuts that hit carers hard. They've questioned whether carers' allowance was perhaps a deliberate target in these reforms.
A deliberate target.
That's the question they posed. And they contrasted cutting support for carers with recent pay increases for trade unions, questioning the fairness.
How did the government respond to that criticism?
They defended their plan. contrasting it with the earlier voucher proposal, saying this is different. They also highlighted significant investment elsewhere.
Investment where?
They pointed to up to £1 billion per year being invested in employment support, specifically designed to help people with health conditions or disabilities get back into work.
Okay, so linking benefit reform with work support.
Yeah.
It does sound like clear communication about all this will be vital. People must be very anxious.
Absolutely crucial. There's clearly a lot of anxiety and confusion already among recipients and advisors. The government has acknowledged this need for clarity.
What are they doing on that front?
They've committed to publishing accessible, easy-read versions of the Green Paper, and then there will be a formal 12-week consultation period for feedback.
People might have blue badges for disabled parking. Are they affected by PIP changes?
The government was clear on this point. They stated that eligibility for blue badges is not affected by these proposals.
Why not?
Because the proposed changes focus on the daily living component of PIP, not the mobility component, which is what's usually linked to blue badge eligibility.
Got it. So mobility support isn't changing. What about the future of that carer's allowance earnings rule you mentioned?
Yes, besides the immediate increase, there's a longer-term plan. The earnings threshold will eventually be automatically linked to the national living wage.
How will that work?
It'll be set at 16 times the hourly rate of the national living wage, so it should rise automatically each year.
That makes sense. And are they looking at the cliff edge, the way carer's allowance stops completely if you earn just slightly over the limit?
Yes, they are exploring replacing that cliff edge with something called an income taper.
An income taper, meaning the benefit reduces gradually as earnings increase rather than stopping abruptly?
Exactly. That could potentially make it easier for carers to take on slightly more work without losing all their support at once. It's something many groups have called for.
That sounds like a positive structural change, potentially. But let's go back to the overall impact. You mentioned the JRF figures. What about the government's own impact assessments?
Well, their assessments do indicate that the benefit changes taken in isolation could push a significant number of people below the poverty line.
How many?
The figures mentioned were around 250,000 people in total. That includes about 200,000 adults and potentially up to 50,000 children.
250,000 people potentially pushed into poverty. That's deeply concerning.
It is, though the government counters this by saying their modeling anticipates a positive impact from that $1 billion investment in employment support we talked about. They hope that will mitigate the negative effects.
It's a big hope. What about carers looking after people who need constant supervision, someone who really can't be left alone? Could they lose out?
The government's view seems to be that individuals needing that level of constant care are likely those who will continue to qualify for the higher rates of PIP, even under the reformed system.
And if they still get PIP?
Then their carers should remain eligible for carer's allowance. That's the logic. But of course, the detail of the new PIP assessment will be key.
So, despite the concerns raised, the government isn't withdrawing the policy.
No, they stated the policy won't be withdrawn. But they did say they will reflect on the points raised and that the consultation will be thorough. They seem open to refining the details based on feedback.
Do we know roughly what proportion of current PIP claimants might keep their awards?
They did give an estimate. The government stated that around 90% of people currently receiving the daily living component of PIP are expected to continue receiving some level of payment after the changes.
90%. And what about people nearing the end of life?
The special rules for terminal illness, which fast-track claims and provide higher rates, are expected to be maintained. Those protections will remain.
Okay.
Yep.
So that consultation seems really important then for shaping the final outcome.
It really does. They specifically mention wanting to gather feedback from disabled people's groups and disability rights campaigns to inform how the reforms are finally implemented.
And is the actual PIP assessment process itself changing? How they decide who gets what?
Yes, that's under review too. They're looking at the assessment criteria, the indicators and descriptors used, which were originally developed back in 2013.
So updating the assessment itself.
Correct. The terms of reference for that specific review are going to be made public. There's also a proposal, which many have called for, to introduce default audio recording of PIP assessments.
Audio recording. Why is that significant?
To improve accuracy and transparency and address long-standing concerns some claimants have had about their experiences being misrepresented in assessment reports.
I see. That could build some trust. One last area, young carers. Are they considered in all this?
They were mentioned. Obviously, carer's allowance itself isn't payable to those under 16, but the impact on households with young carers is being considered. It highlights the need for cross-government work, joining up support across education, work, and the benefit system for carers of all ages.
It's definitely a complex picture. Big changes proposed, aiming for sustainability, focusing on need, but with real concerns about the impact, especially on carers and poverty levels.
Precisely. The consultation outcomes and the eventual legislation debated in Parliament will be crucial in determining the final shape of these reforms. It's certainly one to watch.
A final thought for our listeners. These potential shifts really underscore how complex it is to design a welfare system that's both fair and sustainable. What aspects of this stand out most to you, and what other questions does it raise about support for disabled people and their carers in the future?
Lots to think about there.
As always, check out the episode notes for more details on today's topic. Find us on social media at Bench Report UK. Take care.
Take care, everyone.
Hello there, this is Tom, the producer of The Bench Report. Listener suggestions are vital to my mission of making politics more accessible and accountable. So, if you have an issue that's really important to you, personally or professionally, and want to know what those in power are doing about it, please get in touch via email or via our socials at Bench Report UK. I'll grab another coffee and start scanning those parliamentary archives.